Someday, maybe I'll do a course on the early economic history of Taiwan. It's an interesting subject. But that course isn't this course. This course is on Taiwan's modern economic development. And I'll just start it by telling you a few stories about the early history of Taiwan to give you an idea of what this place was like before the modern economic development started. I hope by now you've got the idea that Taiwan was a place of business. People came here to make money. It wasn't a traditional place. People weren't just following in the footsteps of their parents and their grandparents and their great-grandparents. Many of the people here were migrants or children of migrants. They had come and they were doing something new that their ancestors hadn't done. And they were open to new ideas and new ways to try to better their lives. Taiwan was also a pretty rough place. In fact, it was sometimes a very violent place. Taiwan, I'm afraid in some ways was kind of a crude place. If you've read economic history, many of the economic histories, they concentrate maybe on the intellectual class in Taiwan, the officials, the poets, the emperors, okay, these people at the top. Well, if you've read a lot about those people, that's not going to help you understand Taiwan very much. Okay? Maybe if you want to understand Taiwan, if you've read something about the overseas Chinese in Southeast Asia, that might give you a little more insight. Because they too were migrants. They had gone abroad to try to make money somehow, and they were generally rough, not very well educated people. Now, was this early history of Taiwan, this early development, could we call this a success? And I'm going to tell you that it was a limited success. Okay? It was a success in one very clear way. When the Dutch came here in the 1620s, they tried to estimate, how many people are on the island. They thought probably about 100,000 people. Probably been like that already for 2 or 3 centuries. Then by 1895, when the Japanese take over, there are now 3 million people on Taiwan. So the same natural resources are now supporting over 30 times more people. That's success. Okay, so that's the successful part of Taiwan's story. Living standards, they also, I think, at least kept up with the mainland. Probably people in Taiwan were a little richer than the average person on the mainland, though we don't really have the statistics to be sure about that. The mainland was a big place with poor areas and rich areas. But Taiwan probably compared okay. Taiwan was a food exporter. This was an agricultural economy, and they were producing more agricultural goods than they generally needed. So, there were sometimes bad harvests and shortages, but most of the time, food could be exported to the mainland to help people there that didn't have enough food. So, these are ways in which, Taiwan's early economic development was certainly a success. But this success is limited. About the worst thing that I've been able to see about Taiwan in the, before the modern economic development was the short lifespan of the people. When the Japanese came here, in 1905, 1906, about this time, they tried to estimate the average life expectancy of the average Taiwanese. They came up with this figure of about in the mid-20s. Okay? And that's really short lifetime. Now, one reason the figure is so low is because there was so many Taiwanese that died as children. In fact, maybe a quarter or more than a quarter of them died before they were 1 year old. Okay? Children died very often. So that's one problem here. If you'd lived to be maybe 13 or 14, you got through your childhood diseases, you could probably have expected to live into your 40s. But that's not very long. You don't have time to really accumulate a lot of human capital. You gotta get out there and get to work young and establish a family and have children young. Okay, that's the only way you're going to continue your family if you're only going to live up into your 40s. Another thing about Taiwan at this time was there was little urbanization. And urbanization is important for the division of labor. If you want to get a lot of specialization, usually you have to have cities. Taiwan was mainly a population that was spread out. The cities of Taiwan, places like Tainan, were really no more than big towns. There were walled cities, but the number of people in them were probably in the tens of thousands. Okay, the biggest city that really influenced Taiwan's economic development was across the strait in Xiamen. Okay, if you cross the strait, if you were in the south of Taiwan and you needed to do some trading, you probably didn't go to the north of Taiwan, you'd go to Xiamen. And if you were in the north of Taiwan, you probably didn't often go to the south of Taiwan, but if you needed to trade, you might go to Xiamen. Okay, that was the big city that had the most influence on Taiwan at this time. Now, one reason there was probably little urbanization is because, the poor health. If you have a lot of diseases like you had in Taiwan, it's dangerous to put everybody together in a big city. The diseases are often contagious. The sort of disease problems they had in Taiwan that kept the lifespan short and kept people from clustering together in big cities too much were things like malaria, those sort of tropical diseases. Cholera was a problem in the 19th century. A lot of people just died of diarrhea. You get a stomach flu, and there wasn't any way to stop that back then. Some people just basically dehydrated from diarrhea and died. Another reason there wasn't so much urbanization is because transportation within the island was very poor. There's very few public goods. I'm going to talk more about that in a second. I also want to say more about the violence. Okay, Taiwan was a pretty violent society, and of course violence is always going to, at least in the short run, it's always going to hurt your economic development. It's destructive. People die. So let me look a little bit at this violence. Qing Dynasty Taiwan was violent. The Qing Dynasty as a whole, okay, the whole area of China was pretty violent too, okay, but Taiwan was considered a place of particular violence. And there was a saying that the official class had about Taiwan. They said Taiwan was a place with an uprising every 3 years and a rebellion every 5. This painting here is a painting that was made of one of the early rebellions in the 1700s. And this is where they're putting down one of the last cities that had rebelled, and thus the Qing army, surrounding the town and putting it to flames. This is these sort of things happen in Taiwan. Usually it wasn't rebellion against the government, though that happens. Okay, there was 2 or 3 times that Taiwan looked like it kind of broken away from the mainland, and then they had the Qing had to send armies in to take it over again. Most of the violence, though, was probably between ethnic groups, between Aborigines, between mountain Aborigines and plain Aborigines, between Aborigines and Chinese, between different types of Chinese, the Hakka, the Keja people, and the Minnan people, sometimes called the Hokla. There was struggles with this. Also, within the Minnan people's group, there was 2 big groups of people that, they would fight a lot. There was just fights between villages, okay, that would just over maybe water rights. So there was always this constant threat of violence, okay, and that made Taiwan a hard place to live in. One of the things that happens in this sort of situation is when you start getting a little bit of money, you don't want to invest it all just in production, maybe into farmland or something. Of course, you do that, but you also have to invest in protection. And sometimes it pays to invest in predation, so you can take other people's property. One of the things the strongmen would do when they got property, they would take some of that money and they would set up private armies here in Taiwan. And the Taiwan government kind of looked the other way with this. Generally, the Taiwan government's attitude was that, if we don't have a lot of complaints from an area and they pay their taxes, we'll just kind of let them alone and let the powerful families there kind of control the place and run it the way they want to run it. One of the people that built up a big private army was down in Taichung. These were the Wu Feng Lins. There's a powerful family down there. One of the Wu Feng Lins, Lin Wencha, he was a person with a large army, a large private army, and to keep in good with the government, whenever there was a rebellion, he would, go out with his army and help them fight against whoever was rebelling. Because, it's important to, you want to invest in good relations with the government, too, if you want to protect yourself. That's what he did. And when the Taiping Rebellion broke out on the mainland, that was one of the biggest civil wars in the history of China, he went over there and he helped the government put down the Taipings. Because of this, he got a really good place in the government as a pretty high-level general. He came back with even more power to Taiwan. That's his picture here. And then the other picture here is is of the homestead area. If you go down to Wufeng near Taichung today, you can see the old family estate of the Lins. Also, there's this book, if you want to read about the Lins, what a strong man's family in Taiwan looks like and the problems they ran into and how they managed to keep control of things. A Chinese Pioneer Family, okay, by Meskill. Okay, they do a pretty good job of going through the family's old records and telling you about the ups and downs of the family. And there were downs, okay, because if you get too powerful, people get jealous. And so no matter how big and powerful you get, you always have to be careful. But Taiwan had a lot of people like the Wufeng Lins, so they were probably one of the biggest. Each area did have their strong families that probably had a lot of land. Could very, very definitely have a private army to make, protect themselves and maybe also push other people around. I also said there was little public goods. There's few public goods in Taiwan. The government here, didn't seem to want to invest much. I've mentioned that, irrigation was like this. In the mainland, it seems like the big irrigation projects seem to have been done mainly by the government. I haven't been able to find examples of private irrigation projects in the mainland where the government gave a private individual the right to water, and then other farmers had to pay that individual water rents for the water. Here in Taiwan, that was just the normal procedure. Okay, if you wanted irrigation, the private sector had to do it itself. There wasn't any help from the public sector, except to give property rights to those investors that were willing to put down the money. Roads were a problem. Really, the Taiwan government only kept up one road. It was the big north-south road, and it wasn't really a very big road, but they tried to keep it passable so that officials and the army could get back and forth. It was mainly for control, though people would also use it, of course, for commerce. But this road didn't have much in the way of bridges. In Taiwan, they only built bridges over creeks. The island is cut by these big rivers. Most of the time they're not that big, but when a typhoon comes, they become very big. So you have these rivers that most of the time are maybe just spread out gravel beds. But when the typhoon comes, they turn into torrents of water. Well, since the river's always changing, it's a very hard thing to bridge. The first time they tried to bridge one of these rivers, they spent a lot of money on it. I think maybe about a year's of taxes, and it was destroyed within a year by a typhoon. So, Taiwan, it was hard to build bridges here. You just use ferries for the big rivers. If you wanted to build a bridge, though, the government very seldom did this. What would happen is local people in an area, maybe organized by a strong man, but not necessarily. Maybe it's just a bunch of villagers get together. They would decide where the bridge was needed. They would collect money. And when you collected money, each person would say how much they were willing to pay for this bridge. They would collect all the money, and then how much each person paid for the bridge would be put on a stone marker beside the bridge, so that when people crossed the bridge, they could look over and they could see, who is it that created this bridge? Who should I be grateful to? And of course, this kind of is a problem of face. If you're a rich family in the area, you're kind of under pressure to put your money into these sort of public works projects like bridges. Okay, if you don't, people will start wondering why, and maybe you'll start, getting a lot of social pressure. So they try to use this kind of social pressure to create some of these public works, okay, but it was always limited what you could do. Sanitation was something else that was really terrible. Now, if you read foreigners talking about Taiwan at this time, you have to remember that the 19th century, the late 19th century, when the foreigners really talk a lot about visiting Taiwan, this is a period where in Europe and the United States, there's a big sanitation movement going on. And a lot of people are convinced that the difference between civilization and barbarism is the sanitation. How are you going to get rid of the sewage? How are you going to get fresh water? How are you going to get lighting, too, into a city? So when they would come to Taiwan, they would always criticize the sanitation. But the sanitation was very easy to criticize. There was very little of it. And when the Japanese came, they found out that it was a big problem, and one of the things they had to do was try to somehow improve the sanitation in the cities in Taiwan. they went out to in the countryside, testing wells, trying to figure out which wells were clean, which wells' waters were polluted. So this was a big problem. Sometimes the Westerners would come to Taiwan and they would say, I thought such and such was the dirtiest city in the world, but I was mistaken. It's right here. And they'd name one of the cities of Taiwan and say, this is the dirtiest city in the world. Okay, it wasn't dirty. Now, also another thing foreigners would note is when they went into, say, a village of the Aborigines and compared it with a village of Chinese, they admitted that the Chinese were generally richer, but they did sometimes comment and say the Aborigines villages were cleaner. So, there's probably, maybe the way the Aborigine society was set up, there was more social pressure to make sure, people didn't dirty up the village. Chinese society, maybe it was somewhat more individualistic. I mentioned something about the ferries. If you had a river crossing, you almost had to use a ferry. Okay? There could be different types of ferries. You could, in theory, just have a private ferry where the ferryman, asks a certain amount of money, okay, to cross. This might be a problem, though, because, most ferries, they were set up as, they had to have property rights. They wouldn't set it up if they were afraid that, there might be other people coming in competing with them. So generally what would happen is a local group of people would get together and they would decide that we're going to establish an official ferry here. And then, again, just like the bridge, they would collect money from people in the area. They would put up a stone marker, like what's in the picture here. They would write down how much each person donated. The donation usually goes to buying land. And then the ferryman basically is like the landlord, the person that takes charge of the ferry. He can make part of his money from the ferry, by getting the rent from the farmland that was donated to support the ferry. Some ferries that are set up this way might be free, but it was often common that they would have the ferries would have a small fee. Okay, if you take the ferry, you should pay a little money. Okay? The fee wasn't arbitrary; it was usually written right on the tablet. Okay, so they would put up the tablet. They'd say, "We're establishing this ferry. These people have donated so much money. If you take the ferry, you have to pay this much money." Okay, so you didn't bargain about it or anything. It was right there on the signpost, pretty much. So, Taiwan was a place where the government didn't spend much money generally. Okay? People had to figure out how to provide their own public goods, and it was interesting seeing how well they did this. But again, it's a limited success. You can do small public goods projects, but the big ones are probably too hard. They're just not done in Taiwan. There was some attempts to reform Taiwan. The most famous was Liu Mingchuan, who came here. He was a general who came here in the Sino-French War, when the French invaded Taiwan for a few days. He was there, and once the French left, he was kind of given charge of the island. And he tries to do some reforms. One thing, is you need to reform, you need taxes. So one of the things he did is he did a big land survey. And looking back at it, we can see what he did is he surveyed all the best land. There was a lot of more marginal land he didn't survey, and it wasn't surveyed till the Japanese came. But he surveyed the best land, and he put taxes on it. And he tried to increase the tax base. He used that money partly to try to expand the Chinese area by pushing back the Aborigines. And also, he wanted to establish a bigger camphor industry. Okay, so he would help secure the camphor areas. He wanted to proclaim more mountains for the tea industry. We'll talk about the tea industry in the next unit. But he also started doing modernization. And the most famous thing he did is he built a railroad. There was a small railroad on the mainland that was shut down. He managed to get hold of that track. He brought it to Taiwan. He built a railroad from Keelung, the northern part of the port of the island, all the way down to Hsinchu. When you get to Hsinchu, then you're starting to get into the really big rivers, so he couldn't get any further than that. Okay. This railroad, it was small scale. It probably didn't make a profit. In fact, if you figure out the costs and benefits, it may have had more costs than benefits. But, it was a good attempt to try to start linking up more of the island. Besides this, he would do things like setting up lights in Taipei. He tried to put up a lighting system run with electric generators. He did this for a few years. again, it was decided that this was costing more than it was worth. Okay, and they quit it. So, he tried to do some things to make Taiwan a more modern place to live. Problem is, to do this, you need money and technology, and it seemed like that he had a hard time getting these things to work. Eventually, he goes back to the mainland. New people come in, and they're not really, so hepped up on this idea of, trying to modernize Taiwan. So, why was Taiwan's success limited? And my idea is that the main thing that limited Taiwan's success was probably the lack of government. Okay, there's the most basic division of labor and economy is between the producers and kind of the protective class, the people that are protecting the property rights and the people that are judging the disputes, the government, okay, the people that are making sure that everybody follows the rules, that creates the rules, okay, that class of people. If you have like a basketball game and you get a bunch of friends after school, maybe it's after high school or something, you get out there, you get the basketball players, you divide up teams, you're playing for fun. You don't really need a referee. Okay, the stakes aren't that high. You all know each other. Okay, you're not going to probably cheat too much. So you basically you just play. And if you think somebody gets out of hand, you might say, hey, that's a foul. And okay, you discuss it. Okay. And that's kind of the way Taiwan tended to work, at least at the local level here. Okay. Once, though, you get at the higher level, where you're playing for higher stakes, and you're playing with lots of people from farther distances away that don't really know each other, okay, now you've got a problem. Okay, if you tried to play an NBA game without a referee, that would be a mess. Okay, I mean, winning and losing is just too important. Okay, and the players, they're very competitive, and they're not really friends. Okay, so you got to have a referee that's going to be out there and it's going to make the calls. Okay, so that's the same thing with an economy. Economists like to say that competition is good, but competition is not necessarily good. Okay? I mean, sometimes competition can be violent competition. Who kills who? Okay, that's not any sort of good competition. Competition is only good if you've got good rules of the game that are being enforced correctly. And the whole idea in economics is you want to set up a game where the only way you can win this game is by producing better goods at cheaper prices than anyone else. And if that's really the only way people can win the game and get rich, okay, well, that's a good game, and competition will be good for society. Okay? But that's not easy. Okay, and what was happening in Taiwan is that you didn't really have a very strong referee. Taiwan was not an anarchy. There were, officials were sent over from the mainland. There were soldiers posted to keep the peace. If, somebody got murdered, the relatives, they could go to the government and demand a trial. The problem with these trials is that when we look at the records, we see that trials often go on for years and years, particularly if they're more like civil disputes, over, say, people not paying rent. Those things can last forever. And the government also seems to have been, often kind of corrupt. So in many cases, people take them out of the court. It's a negative-sum game. Okay, basically that means is both sides can lose. Even if I win, I might not win enough to cover all the bribes and all the fees I've had to pay, okay, to get through this court process. So most people preferred to kind of keep the government as far away as possible and just let's try to figure this stuff out by ourselves. Okay? So this was also an important thing to understand with Taiwan society. Taiwan society often seemed to be kind of cliquish. Okay? It wasn't the big clans like they have in the mainland because people had migrated over here often as individuals. And so you didn't have the big family clans that would stick together and try to promote the interest of the clan. Back in the Minnan area, there were a lot of clan wars. It was pretty famous for its clan wars, where one clan would think that land was theirs, another clan would claim it, and then they would actually go to war. And often, the dispute was settled by war, and the government wouldn't come in till later, just to pretty much say, okay, who won, okay, well, you're right, okay, and they They just kind of let people settle this stuff themselves there through the clans. In Taiwan, people often try to settle these things by forming voluntary groups. Okay? For this reason, Taiwan had a lot of religion. Okay? It was a very religious society, and it's not religious in the sense that they really cared a lot about the afterlife, I guess, though they probably did too. Okay? What the religion often did was it was a way of organizing people together. People in a village often organized around a local temple. And the temple, in many ways, in the village was almost like the city hall. And the leaders of the village would get together. They would hold a meeting in the city hall, the temple, right there with the god sitting in and watching. And you kind of hope that with a god there watching you, people are going to be a little more honest. They're not going to fight so much because you don't want to get the god upset at you. Maybe that's another reason a lot of times in Taiwan you'll see the marketplaces are often in front of a temple. And maybe you figure that people are going to cheat a lot less with the god right there watching. Okay? If you had like an irrigation project, okay, the big irrigation stuff was done maybe by a private entrepreneur, but once you got the little the little irrigation canals into the village, that was something the village took care of itself often, and they would probably have an earth god association where they'd all worship the earth god together. They would have a big a big religious celebration once a year, and they would try to organize this way to try to settle any of the irrigation disputes they might have among themselves. Sometimes they would form societies of the same surname society. Everybody with the name of Li kind of pretends that they're relatives, and this is a way of making connections. Maybe it gives you some protection. Okay, it's a way to get a network going. Okay, so you're not just a small individual that can be crushed by the more powerful people. So in Taiwan, they found thousands of these religious groups, and partly maybe people are worshiping. They're trying to hope the God's going to help them have a good harvest. Okay, that plays a role. But one of the most important roles of these religious associations was just forming networks of people that could support each other. Okay, that was very, very important in a place in Taiwan where the family clans were just not that important. Okay, so you had to rely on voluntary organization. So that's basically all I want to say about early Taiwan. Okay, just keep in mind, when we start developing the place, this is a very commercial place. Okay? It's a very rough place. Okay? It's a place where connections are very important because there's not a very strong rule of law, and that's probably what's holding back the society.